Good morning, everyone. Last day of the conference. Nice, small, intimate group, which is good for the Q&A portion of today. My name is Mike DeBakey. I've presented P&C on a variety of topics here, so one of my research interests as a network engineer has always been kind of doing things better and seeing what all good network engineering practices, what all the impacts of those best practices can be. One of them is voice over IP, and actually sort of looking at the groundswell of changes in the IP telephony space. Just to show hands, how many people implement voice over IP in some part of their network, whether the carrier side or the PBX side? Okay, so basically everyone or looking at it. So I'm from Lancaster, Lebanon, 9013. We are, as the name implies, Lancaster, Lebanon counties, about 30 minutes southeast of Harrisburg. We have about 22 districts and several private schools and some charter schools as well that we count as customers. And so I sort of look at how we can do voice effectively. We also have a marketplace contract for voice over IP service through Telesystem, which I'll kind of talk about at the end, but this is pretty much a vendor agnostic session just to look at some of the trends and help understand what all voice over IP can potentially impact on your network and how you can implement it effectively. So the first thing I'll look at, I think one thing I see with a lot of districts is we have them send us their telephone bills, and we always see a lot of this telecom geek speak on here. You'll see things like CLEC, PRIs, DIDs. You'll see some things that might talk about ISDN or certain blocks of numbers. You probably won't see the line item about E-rate because there is no E-rate funding for voice services anymore as of the modernization order of 2015. The other thing you might see is some references to Centrex, which is essentially kind of the old school hosted model for voice services. And if you see Centrex on your bill, you've got to definitely give your carrier a call and understand if you're actually using those services. They just love to add them to individual lines, and they're like a rate multiplier. So If there's one thing you take away from today, it's to go back and look at your bill. So I'm going to go through a couple of these pieces here, and also look at some of the fees. And fees are probably the number one reason why people look at going to SIP trunks on the carrier side. And you know, when I say SIP trunks, a lot of people think, you know, 5-10 years ago, the Vonage type carriers, Magic Jack, those kinds of things. And although they do have SIP communication on the back end, which essentially SIP is basically packetized voice, taking what you used to use on your phone line, breaking it up, and then sending it over TCP/IP back to the carrier's network. So, but that doesn't have to be. There are a lot of carriers that are sort of using an enterprise version of that lets you either bring your own device on the back end to say, I can buy my own ATA device to break those things out into POTS lines. You can buy certain devices that will break them out into PRIs, or most newer phone systems that you can install, the PBX side, can take those SIP trunks, those SIP connections directly from the carrier to your infrastructure. You might need a device called an SBC, which I'll talk about a little bit, a session border controller. That's sort of a voice firewall, I like to call it. But anyway, so that's basically on the tech side. But you know, when we're talking about the fees, how many people here manage the phone system versus, well, I should say, how many in your district, how many districts actually have IT manage the phone system? Okay. So that didn't used to be. We used to see a lot of the maintenance departments actually handling, you know, the configuration and day-to-day operations, bringing the service folks in to actually add on new pieces of the phone system. And the other thing we've seen with that is that IT rarely sees the phone bill, so the business office will pay it and not really audit, you know, what they're getting exactly. So this is where all these fees come in. I'm not going to go over each individual fee, but just suffice to say, there are several charges the FCC allows the carriers to pass through, and you've also got federal and state taxes involved. You've got universal service charges, and this, you know, we sort of have a vested interest in, as schools, in the universal service fund. So we have to pay into it. On the telecom side, there's some discussion right now in Washington about whether USF charges should get passed on to broadband connections as well, which I expect to happen at some point. But right now we see it with telephone services. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, schools and libraries, rural broadband, healthcare, that kind of thing. So it's essentially a pot of money that certain organizations and governmental entities can take advantage of to build out their networks. There are certain 911 charges that are imposed that help to sort of, with some of the costs of managing the 911 PSAP or the operations centers in each of the counties in Pennsylvania. There are some fees related to pass-through charges for local number portability. Local number portability is a great thing, but it didn't come for free. So the carriers always let you know that when there's any LNP charge component. Also telecommunications relay for certain types of services that help people with hearing or speech disabilities. You got the 411 charges, directory assistance, operator assisted calls, which are now really not even serviced by a physical operator anymore. And then there are obviously the features. A couple years ago, carriers still charged for touch tone service. That's where that would fall under. I certainly hope no one's paying a fee for touch tone service anymore. And then sometimes you get charges for single bill, like, and a couple things fall under that. If you're getting a paper bill, sometimes they can add a fee in for that. You could add 10 or more other charges under there that the carriers can add on. But the point I want to make here is, you know, you have to sort of differentiate the fees they're mandated to charge versus the ones they've just passed through to maintain their own infrastructure. So definitely want to be an informed consumer. Some of the other trends here that have sort of been disruptors to the industry. Of course, the most famous thing, the antitrust breakup of AT&T. Prior to that, pretty much there was one phone company for the whole country, which is sort of crazy to think of. But they had to be split up into 7 regional carriers as per the court ruling. And AT&T could still retain their long distance business. And then, of course, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 sort of created this, these 2 acronyms, ILEC and CLEC. So you essentially have incumbents, which maintain the physical infrastructure and service basically all customers within a geographic region. And then you have CLECs, which are essentially the overbuilders, you could call them, companies that can actually compete for business or local service among the other carrier infrastructure. And that was a huge thing to happen, and it pretty much let anyone enter the telecommunications industry. So pretty much any of us now could launch our own telephone company. And obviously in 1996, the other thing that was happening was broadband was starting to hit more of the country, and just more of a reliance on IP delivered services. So it's definitely where the industry was going, but the biggest thing was the telecom industry didn't want to have a disruption to the revenue path either. So the other thing sort of mentioned, switching from dedicated circuit switches to packet switching. And so with the circuit switch telephone network, you essentially need a dedicated pair of copper circuits whenever you place a call from station to station. And packet switching essentially takes that and has a shared network model. So it certainly could be used to look at what we do with IP communications. No one gets a dedicated circuit from end to end. It's essentially packetized and sent from one station to another in that respect. So that's probably the easiest way to understand that. And we also have a lot more people using cell phones. So that's also been a significant disruptor, specifically to the long distance market. Here are just a couple of carriers we've seen. And most of these companies, they're traditional phone companies. Comcast and Verizon now have also had to go toward voice over IP as well in delivering services, and it's also been still a pretty carrier-friendly market. We've seen that growth in the need for wireless data as well, and in fact LTE was I shouldn't say elements of 3G, but certainly 4G was basically the first IP native voice platform for the cellular industry. And we've seen a lot more things converge onto one wire. So we're now looking at not having those dedicated circuits that you come into your circuit packs on the PBX. There aren't separate phone lines anymore. We're looking at delivering voice and data over one connection, and that can take effect in a couple different ways. We've also seen a differentiation between the consumer and enterprise voice market. The Magic Jack and Vonage, definitely more consumer oriented. The hardware's not proprietary, but they might block you out of the actual management side of it, and then they pretty much give you this option for this price, and you have to use their specific hardware. Although some of them are moving away from that. Call-centric is a good example. Also VoIP.m, I use VoIP.ms at home. You can bring your own device, and you basically pay per minute, or you can get an unlimited option as well, and that's offered as a consumer option now. Enterprise voice, you pretty much are able to do a direct SIP trunk from your PBX. You don't have to use any specific carrier hardware other than the DMARC device that they would put on premise. And that's mostly what we're going to focus on today. And so suddenly, when we look at delivering voice over IP over existing infrastructure, we obviously look at the internet as a little more critical if you're delivering that IP communication across your public internet connection that you're already getting into your school building. Some carriers will give you a dedicated internet circuit. It's actually not necessarily an internet connection. It's basically a transit to their voice network as well. But I would consider that, as long as it's IP infrastructure, it's still pretty critical because you need phone calls to work. E-rate, like I mentioned earlier, No longer E-rate money available for telephone services. They started a 20% phase out in 2015. So that was probably a good thing for the overall E-rate budget, because we've also seen as a result that E-rate's now paying for a lot more Category 2 devices with network switches, routers, wireless, that typically they didn't cover before. So you have some of the competition that we've seen between the carriers. Territories between carriers, some become somewhat irrelevant. Voice over IP is not subject to the Title II Common Carrier Classification, so essentially it can ride anyone's last mile for the infrastructure. And that's pretty important, again, because everyone who's using voice over IP, at least on the consumer market, is using their own broadband connection and not relying really on anything else from the pole, except typically cable modem. It'll work on DSL, definitely probably not as good an experience, although you don't need a lot of bandwidth, but when you have smaller bandwidth circuits, you have a little more contention from a quality of service perspective. And long distance is frequently included, which is, today we don't think of that at all, mostly because we use cell phones for most of our calling, but that used to be a big thing. You had to pick your long distance carrier in the old days, and you typically were limited to your local carrier, but you could pick anyone you wanted for long distance. Now, all of these plans typically have long distance thrown in. There's still a fee for international calling, but that's another area where we've seen some with the Vonage and even Comcast with their voice over IP product has a few countries thrown in there as well. So the old days, and I graduated high school in 2000, and I still remember this model of having the switchboard operator in school. She didn't quite have the cables plugged in like this one would, but someone who took calls, the district receptionist. There were very limited places for teachers to make phone calls in their buildings. They had to go to the office or sometimes the faculty room. They maybe had to dial a code to call long distance. Maybe still like that today. Everyone has to dial a PIN code. And only a few people had access to long distance calls. Well, today, with all the parents that move in and have cell phone and area codes from all over the country, phone access without long distance is kind of pointless, we understand. And so there's basically kind of this new reality of telecom access being ubiquitous. So and we've seen it within an organization at IE13. We actually don't give anyone a handset. Everyone uses a Skype for Business client on their computer. We have a few handsets in some of our classrooms, but that's mostly for emergency access. If someone needs to pick up a phone really quick, call 911 or whatever, we have that registered to one of our PBXs. But the vast majority of our 1,300 plus employees are using a soft phone client on their computer. So roaming and where I can go to make a long distance call are pretty irrelevant for us, and I suspect also for many school districts that's where the trend is as well, because phones are expensive. It's another piece of hardware. So the end of the dial tone. The last time, it's really hard remembering when I actually picked up the phone and got a dial tone, if you think about it. So there are a few options for traditional carrier services. They're offered by a telephone company or a company operating as a CLEC, as a telephone provider. There is quite a bit of crossover between telephone and data providers, so they could offer those circuits over, they could give you what's called an ISDN PRI circuit, which looks like it's basically an RJ45 jack, and that plugs into specialized hardware that takes those channels. You get 23 voice channels on it, one data channel, and essentially you get 23 lines out of it. Or you could have analog POTS lines, with every same kind of line you have at home. You would basically be able to break those out and plug those directly into your PBX from the carrier as well. All of these options require on-site PBX. like I mentioned, the Centrex option was the earliest version of hosted voice, and that was still carrying over copper from the telephone company, and that was essentially a digital handset service, was not IP enabled, and you paid per extension. But per extension, you would get pretty much everything. You get voicemail, long distance, and you'd be able to call station to station within your organization. And so we've sort of seen that morph into business class voice over IP and hosted as well. So now you can basically receive that service over your cable modem and carry internet, sort of an EDI circuit or dedicated internet, or cloud hosted. And cloud is essentially the new version of Centrex. If you're essentially taking all of your IP-enabled handsets and registering them to a cloud-hosted PBX, really the same thing you got with Centrex, except definitely less expensive. And you're looking at rate options that are sort of metered per channel, and that's quite a distinction, because the old way of metering was pretty much per minute. But now, if you buy most SIP services, it's priced based on SIP trunk, and you say, I want 10 concurrent calls, I'm going to pay for 10 channel options, and yeah, it doesn't matter how many minutes. They're generally unlimited, of course, unless you're looking at international calling. And there are fewer fees, and so that's a very broad statement, but with less regulation, generally comes fewer fees with the telecom industry. When you're looking at your unified communications plan, you have to sort of understand what problem you're trying to fix. So, are you trying to reduce those monthly recurring costs? Are you looking for an overall total cost of ownership reduction? Do you have public safety issues with your current platform? Understanding when someone calls 911 from any one of your handsets, what number is presented to the PSAP. If you guys know right now how that call flow looks. Understanding how having a mobile workforce can impact your unified communications plan as well. If you have any people who are working from home, in schools, it's pretty much everyone is there working standard 7:30 to 4:30 schedule, but you do now have a lot of people interested in distance learning for snow days. You have teachers and administrators who might be home for whatever reason, that might need to still be connected to their phone calls. So pretty much just like with data, telephone's no different. Everyone wants to be connected anywhere, anytime. And understanding what the process looks like for procurement in your district is pretty important. So having that discussion with the business office as to what procurement options you go through for voice, for cell phones, and understanding what the timeline has to be on it. One of the great things is, I mentioned, E-rate doesn't really apply anymore for phone, so you don't have that inflexible timeline that we're all familiar with when we do E-rate C1 and C2 applications. But there's also no more money for telecom in that anymore either. So, blessing and a curse. Also, there has to be, environment validation by all of us. So before, I worked, the first district I worked in, maintenance took care of everything end to end with the phone system. And that was great. It was less to worry about. But the reality is the phone system was aging, and the pot of money that anything comes out of when it comes to break fix in the district, although it might not be your budget, it does directly impact the overall district operational footprint. So, and it was pretty clear, that it was costing a lot of money to maintain a digital aging product. So, the deal was that, and this is in my particular district, years ago, that once IT took over, we were going to replace the system, so we needed the budget to do that, but it was one less thing that maintenance had to take care of. But we got a couple of other things with it, which was we were able to finally kind of look at the bill and scrutinize the bill to see what we were actually getting. understanding which phone lines we no longer needed. That fax line from 30 years ago that was sitting in some room, we could get rid of that. So really low-hanging fruit. Now I won't say that weeding that stuff out of the bill completely paid for the new phone system, but recurring costs can just kill you with this kind of thing, and especially for smaller districts. One of the bills we looked at for one of our districts had quite a bit of Centrex lines that had, the voicemail and long distance and some other features on it. We found a DSL line that people were paying for that they didn't use. So those kinds of things happen quite a bit. So when IT gets involved and actually looks over the bills, some really good things can happen. And we don't look at it to play detective and get someone in trouble for making that decision 20 years ago. It's just something that helps our overall, footprint. So once again, reviewing your phone bill, really easy to do. And if you have questions, contact your phone carrier and have them tell you, what you're getting on this service, and hopefully they can give you some usage-based data and understand if you're actually using the service as a district. I will say that phone bills have improved quite a bit. Some of these acronyms are actually spelled out. It's a little more of a roadmap or a map of what you're currently getting, but you still need to do some legwork. I mentioned earlier we do at IE13 we have a master agreement with Telesystem. I have Jess Dillers in the back. She's our program director for marketplace services. We can answer any questions you have about it. We've done all the work of bidding SIP trunks. There's also a hosted platform option as well, so that rate lock is until June 30th of 2022. And you can join anytime during the year. You don't have to join, in July 1. You can start anytime you need. Once you procure a new service, you have to understand you're realizing any savings that you expected. And a lot of times when we start, a new data service or phone service, it can take 2 or 3 bills to have the carrier catch up with any charges, any corrections you need to make on the service. So you might not actually understand what you're getting until maybe, a few months into the new contract. Just an overview of what you need for voice over IP to work. People ask all the time, I have this PBX, and they give me their vendor name, and generally I can tell them the vendor name. I can tell them it'll work because I've heard other people that use it, but there are a couple of kind of ingredients to what you need. So you obviously need the call processor, and that's your PBX. That's the part that sits in your data center or sits in your network closet. You've got media endpoints, which can be handsets, soft phone clients, analog telephone adapters. Media gateways, which this is sort of almost a hybrid because you can have an IP-based phone system and take PRI and POT circuits, and all that media gateway does is convert digital circuits to IP and then delivers that traffic from your media gateway to your call processor. So if you have a media gateway already and you've got a network connection on it, your system probably will take SIP trunks because it's already using SIP trunks to communicate between the gateway and the processor. There might be a licensing component. A couple of vendors are ready for SIP out of the box without having to pay extra for it. And others you'll have to license based on the number of trunks or some meter-based option, but it'll work. You obviously need your network infrastructure, your IP network in the buildings. One of the great things with voice over IP, if you're running it on the PBX side, is you don't need to run, a separate set of cabling or 66 blocks just to get your extensions tied in. You can convert a data jack to a voice jack. You can typically plug your laptop or any other assets you have into the back of the phone. And most modern switching equipment will know that if I'm plugging a data device in the phone, it'll put me on the data VLAN. So there are a lot of nice converged features you get just by virtue of putting an IP-based system in. On the provider side, which we talked about when I mentioned the Telesystem contract, that's going to be the company that gives you, either a TDM-based circuit or a direct SIP-based circuit that goes into your phone system. And this is just kind of mile high view of what you've got on a VoIP network. The other thing you can do with soft phone clients is you can load a mobile client onto most phones, most cell phones, and actually create an IP call straight into your voice infrastructure as well. You got your IP PBX. The language spoken between your endpoint and the PBX is governed by basically a codec, which is the way that the call is encoded, and they're high definition codecs. So you can definitely tell if you put a wideband high def headset in your network and you're talking to someone else versus talking to someone over what we call the toll network. Voice quality is just amazing. It's similar to, with iPhones, if you're using FaceTime versus making a traditional cell phone call. Very similar if you're using an HD codec on your system. With the Skype for Business client that we run, it actually uses SIP TLS. So IP network, voice over IP traffic is packetized and sent over TCP ports. It's encrypted end-to-end. Most generic SIP connections from endpoint to PBX are over UDP. So it's important to understand that if you've gotten firewalls in between, that the firewall is SIP aware and that you know what ports traffic is being carried over. Typically from your PBX to your session border controller, which I kind of define as a voice firewall, that's just going to be G711U, which is UDP traffic, and that's essentially, that could be, I wouldn't call it the DMARC. Some carriers can give you an SBC that they configure as a DMARC. That would be your equipment, and then the provider can give you a connection to their soft switch on their network, either through another SBC that they own, which is just an RJ45 connection between the two, or they can actually cloud host the soft switch and your session border controllers connected directly with their system with the public IP address on their end. And I will say, with Telesystem, there's no hardware to put on your network. It's literally just an application SIP trunk connection from whatever hardware you have to their soft switch. The way the pricing models work, I mentioned earlier that everything, with SIP generally is going to a per channel, and that basically is functionally, you can understand it as per line. There are very few per minute costs unless you're doing international dialing, or calling Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, or Canada. Just because you can call using 10 digits doesn't mean it's a free call necessarily, even if you have free long distance. So continental United States generally covered. The other thing you'll find is if you're using E911 numbers, there's an extra cost because the carrier takes over the process of listing that 911 number with the PSAT and updating the location data. Every time you call 911, they need to be informed of the physical address that number is assigned to. So normal DIDs, we say DID, direct inward dial. That's basically a direct number instead of calling an extension. There's a price for that. Typically they're in blocks of 5 or 20. We have 3,000 numbers in our organization, so typically, we'll see bills that are priced based on blocks of 20 or even blocks of 100 if you have that many. Long distance is included for at least the lower 48 states. One of the things you'll see on your phone bill is intra-LATA, intra-LATA, intrastate national call postures. So those are not really something we need to be concerned with anymore. They'll still break those down. Just real quick, when we say LATA, that's basically a geographic boundary. And we think of it mostly when they're overlays. Does everyone know what an overlay is? So in the central PA area, we had one area code for many years, 717, and we ran out of numbers. So when the PUC approved the overlay, that overlay really only concerned the area that was 717, and that area is defined as a LATA. And there are a couple of regulatory reasons to define those geographic areas. There are also rate centers within a LATA. So that's kind of the old thing. In Lancaster, you know, you could call from Lancaster City to anywhere else, let's say Lancaster City to Ephrata or Lidditz or wherever, and it would be a long distance call. So these days, you know, but it would be cheaper to call some other state. So these days, no one cares about that anymore. In the old days, you have to worry if the call was, you know, intra-LATA, intrastate, interstate, you know, that kind of thing. There's less telco infrastructure for VoIP, and if you were to go into the central office of a carrier, and assuming that that carrier did nothing but VoIP business, you would look in there and see a whole bunch of network switches and network routers, and that's it. There would probably be an application component somewhere to handle the switching of those calls. That would be run on a server, you know, like everyone has in their data center. And that, what they run on their side is typically called a soft switch. They'll run a platform typically called Metaswitch, which is just an application that is doing nothing but processing call traffic. But there's no, you look at the old days of, you know, tons of batteries and tons of copper circuits coming into a central office, or a 5ESS switch or something that's just clicking away doing things, and that, you know, some of that stuff still exists for the legacy copper infrastructure. But for voice over IP, it's routers, switches, servers, fiber, just like in your own data center. So less heat, less real estate required, generally, you know, less in terms of admin cost. You're not going to have blocks of long distance minutes with overages. That was the biggest thing that I looked at when I was looking at these services in one of my school districts. That the carrier would come over and say, we give you 3,000 minutes with overages, kind of like when you're looking at copier contracts with included prints and overage costs, and that stuff is really nothing that you should see with VoIP anymore. There's a shift in the industry toward unlimited. I would say most of that was brought in with the cell phone carriers, and it sort of happened with the landline carriers as well. But there's a gotcha here and there. One of the things we look at, I mean, we have a lot of people that move here from Puerto Rico and go, enroll their kid in one of the schools in the area, and they don't change their number. So that means, if we call a parent, it's a Puerto Rican area code, even though they're a block or two away. So that I don't know if I'd call you a gotcha. That was pretty much spelled out that continental U.S. calls are different from Canada and other territories. But you need to get the out-the-door price and understand. And again, this happens after you've looked at your phone bill and understand your trends month to month, and understand how many concurrent calls you need to place. Because you never want to get into a scenario where someone calls your main number and gets a busy signal. That's just terrible. So you have to understand how many people are using the phone at any given time in your system. You should be able to generate that usage data with the help of your phone company pretty easily. How many phone numbers do you need? How many direct dial numbers do you need for what you're doing? Do you want to switch from a receptionist taking the call to a direct number dial? So, and obviously, how are you connecting with the provider? You need to understand: are you getting copper circuits to your provider? Are you using PRIs and POTS lines? And how many of those? Biggest takeaway, IT needs to be involved in the infrastructure planning for all of this. There's a general trend toward media convergence. We've already seen it with video as well. In the old days, if you want to do video conferencing, you needed very expensive infrastructure. You might need a satellite to do what you need, or ISDN just for video. And we've seen that converge onto IP already, and now we're seeing the same thing with voice. Interestingly enough, I think video happened before voice. You also need to look at system redundancy, which a lot of people, their biggest concern with voice over IP is, my internet connection goes down, how do I call it? Well, most, at least in the last 10 years or so, a lot of phone carrier circuits are delivered over fiber optic infrastructure at some point maybe even on those same poles that your internet infrastructure goes across to. And I've had voice outages related to backhoes and all sorts of nasty things as well, and it was a single path in your district. So now the questions that you're going to have about your internet connection are still there, but now you're putting phone calls on there as well. So you'll kind of have to have that same conversation to say, do I need to look at a cable modem backup or LTE backup? And those are really easy to implement with voice over IP. So if you have an SBC device, typically that device will take multiple WAN ports on it. So you could plug your LTE connection or a cable modem in. You can get the lowest cable modem service out there for like $100 a month. Obviously not E-rate eligible, but you could make your phone system infrastructure could be more resilient to an outage than even your commodity internet infrastructure in that case, if you're using like an LTE technology. Because you obviously can put your entire WAN traffic across an LTE circuit. You have to understand when someone calls 911, what path will the call take? Will it bounce around from a backup node in your building out to the PBX? Will it go directly out the PBX? What call path will it take once it hits your PBX? Will the 911 call complete? That's kind of the first question maybe you should ask. And it's really easy. I don't know if anyone's ever tested 911. You call your PSAP. There's a 10-digit emergency number that you call, typically to call the administration at the PSAP and say, hey, is it a slow time for 911 calls? And they'll say, yeah. And tell them you'd like to test your 911 calls and see what numbers presented and what location data they have. And they'll let you do it. But don't just go and dial 911 and say, hey, I'm just testing stuff. Yeah, it's generally a good idea to let them know ahead of time. And keep an eye on E911 regulations. They're getting, the FCC and the PUC in certain states is starting to really start looking at 911 pattern dialing requirements. So some PBXs said you have to dial 9 plus 911. And basically, you can't do that anymore. You have to basically have 911 be an addressable number on your system. And then also has to have a dispatchable location. So there has to be a location tied to any number that's presented to the PSAP. So basically kind of how the web, the existence of the World Wide Web changed how we communicated 20 years ago. I think SIP's doing the same thing to voice traffic. And, and I say that because everything we're using on our cell phone today, like I mentioned with the LTE, all of that is carried over IP. Even if it's a proprietary connection, like FaceTime is definitely proprietary between you and Apple. On the back end, if you were to peel back the layers, you'd probably see SIP traffic going on there. And actually the cell phone carriers and the landline carriers for years have been using SIP traffic to switch international calls as well, for obvious reasons, for cutting costs. So I'll open it up to Q&A, and anyone has any questions about what they're running or what they're looking at doing? Like I said, I've got Jess Diller in the back. Jess, do you want to mention anything about our Telesystem? Yeah, put you on the spot real quick.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we do have a partnership with Telesystem. If you just want to see how it compares to your current provider, we'll be more than happy to send you over a quote, at least to keep them honest and make sure that they have the pricing that you're looking for. We also have Tech Talk Live coming this May. It's at our IU at Lancaster 119013 in Lancaster. We hope to see you there. Telesystems will also be there, and you can ask any questions directly about your services. And we'll also have a bunch of great sessions going on during those 2 days.
If anyone wants a copy of these slides or whatever, I have my business card here, so feel free to grab one and email me, and I can get that to you.
I forgot to mention too, we have recorded a webinar series that go a little bit more in depth in this presentation. If you shoot me an email, I can send you the link to the recorded webinar series. That was a 3-part series that we did about the telephone services. So I can shoot you an email with the link to that webinar series.
We'll probably do a repeat of that this year, I'm thinking too. Yep.
The telesystem, the bid that you guys have, that's just like SIP trunks, right? You just say, I want this many.
Yeah, it's
Turns
SIP
out.
trunks. You just need quantities for DIDs.
And then something
Yeah.
is physically placed in our building, or?
There's no physical placement of any hardware. The only thing you do is you have to certify your phone system can take SIP trunks, and you basically point that at their address, and you can take calls, and it works immediately.
That's
Yeah.
the most cost-effective solution.
Right.
They also do hosted, and they also
Right.
do, put hardware in if you need it to work with their.
Yeah, right. That's a good
Yeah.
caveat. So they can put hardware in there if your system can't take direct SIP, like if you need to take PRIs or ATA or POTS lines. But in which case, they would basically lease you the hardware. For hosted, if you want to do hosted, in other words, you had your own handsets or you got handsets off of them, I do believe they put a piece of equipment on there. And also they have failover options that they can provision as well. But if your system is certified to handle SIP trunks, you don't need to put any hardware on premise. Anyone else? Okay. Well, feel free to grab a business card if you would like a slide deck or want to discuss anything else. And we don't put systems in, so we will never recommend one phone system or another. Everyone always asks me, hey, what system do you guys put in? It's like, we don't, that's not our business. So pretty much our business is looking at the marketplace contract and connecting you with telesystem sales. So. All right. Have a great day and a safe trip. Thank you. Yeah.
Good presentation.
What was that?
Good presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, okay. Where's that? Oh, okay.
Closer to Greensburg.
Okay. It's a short trip for you. For once. Yeah, that's great.
Because I live in Suburban too.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. Good deal. Yep. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming. Great job.
Well, thank you. I like putting it on the spot there. Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah. Missing one, where was that? Oh, you should see that Instagram post right there.
What's the, oh, geez, yeah.
Yeah, I'll show you.
Oh my gosh.
It's great.
Yeah.
You'll love it.
Bet I will.
No, it's not bad.
Oh, okay. my poor man's slide changer. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Jess.
You're welcome.
I was standing off to the side.
Yeah, I was trying to, hard to get both of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It was great. I thought.
Yeah.
I do find it interesting that they don't have any ATs in the room.
They do. There's right there on the
It's
pole.
mobile.
Right, yeah, yeah.
Why?
They just plug them in and, yeah, you think maybe,
Like they're never gonna not need it?
well, I know, like you think for a conference center, they might have a permanent infrastructure in place, but,